The morning sun blazed merciless over Dry Creek's dusty main street. But Clara Wynn felt only the chill of hunger gnawing at her hollow stomach. Her trembling fingers clutched 3 silver coins, her last hope between survival and starvation. As she emerged from Henderson's general store with a precious handful of bean seeds and a rusted hoe that had cost her nearly everything. Well, what's this little mouse doing out of her hole? Thomas Keene's voice cracked like a bullwhip across the desert air. Clara's heart hammered against her ribs as the rancher's son pushed off from the hitching post, his predatory smile spreading wide. At 25, he carried himself with the arrogance of someone who'd never known. Hunger never felt the ground shift beneath his feet like quicksand. Clara pressed the seeds tighter to her chest, feeling their fragility through the thin cloth sack. These tiny promises of life represented weeks of careful saving, of rationing water, and gnawing on wild roots until her stomach cramped with emptiness. "Just minding my own business, Thomas." Her voice came out smaller than she intended, betraying the terror that made her knees weak. "Your business." Thomas stepped closer, and Clara caught the sour smell of whiskey on his breath, despite the early hour. "Your business is being a burden on decent folks. Your business is taking up space meant for real settlers." The circle was tightening. Other men had drifted over ranch hands and store loafers drawn by the promise of entertainment. Clara recognized the hungry look in their eyes, the way predators watched wounded prey struggle. "I have legal claim to that land," Clara said, but her voice wavered like smoke in the wind. Thomas's laugh was ugly as a coyote's howl. "Legal, you!" His hand shot out without warning, striking her arm with vicious force. The seeds exploded from her grip, scattering across the dirt like tiny brown tears. The hoe clattered beside them, its metal ringing against stone with the sound of dreams breaking. Clara dropped to her knees, her hands moving desperately through the dust, as precious seeds rolled toward the horse's hooves. Her 3 silver coins had vanished entirely, swallowed by the hungry earth. Around her boots shuffled and spurs jingled as the crowd pressed closer, some laughing, others turning away, with the guilty relief of those grateful not to be the target. "Look at her scramble," Thomas jeered. "Like a mouse in a grain barrel. Maybe we should put her out of her misery." That's when Clara saw the moccasins. They appeared beside her hands without sound, as if their owner had materialized from the desert wind itself. Clara looked up to see a Comanche man standing over her, his face carved from canyon stone. His black hair touched with silver that caught the harsh morning light. He couldn't have been much older than 30, but his dark eyes held depths that spoke of losses beyond counting. The crowd fell silent. Even Thomas stepped back, his bravado flickering like a candle in a storm. Without speaking, the stranger bent and retrieved Clara's hoe. Then he reached into a beaded medicine pouch at his waist and withdrew something that made Clara's breath catch a perfect eagle feather, its edges touched with gold by the morning sun. He placed both items in Clara's trembling hands. When their fingers brushed, Clara felt a jolt of recognition pass between them. Not attraction, but something deeper. The acknowledgement of one survivor recognizing another of 2 people who understood what it meant to be cast aside by a world that had no use for them. The stranger straightened his movements, fluid as water over stone. He looked at Thomas Keene with eyes that held no fear, no anger, only the patient stillness of a predator who knew his own strength. Then he melted back into the crowd, as silently as he'd appeared, leaving Clara kneeling in the dust with an eagle feather, and the certain knowledge that her life had just taken a turn toward something she couldn't yet name. The silence stretched until Thomas found his voice again, but it cracked with uncertainty now. "This ain't over, Mouse Girl. Not by a long shot." Clara's homestead lay 3 miles northeast of Dry Creek, where the flatlands began their steep climb toward the Sangre de Cristo Mountains. 40 acres of what most folks called worthless land, rocky soil, scattered juniper, and a seasonal creek that ran strong in spring but disappeared by midsummer. It wasn't much, but it was hers by legal right and desperate necessity. Her shelter could barely be dignified with the name. Scavenged timber leaned against a natural rock outcropping covered with a patchwork of canvas bark and stubborn hope. Inside her worldly possessions fit in a single wooden crate, her father's leather-bound journal filled with notes on tracking water and reading weather, a few hand tools bought with carefully hoarded coins, a moth-eaten blanket, and a daguerreotype of her parents taken before consumption claimed them both. The Charity Association wagon train had deposited her in Dry Creek 6 months ago, with the explanation that she was too small and delicate to contribute meaningfully to settlement efforts in the Colorado Territory. Too small, too weak, too much trouble. The story of her life, written in the language of abandonment. But abandonment had forged her into something harder than those who'd cast her aside could imagine. Each dawn brought the same survival ritual emerge from her lean-to and scan the horizon for threats, wild animals, sudden weather, or worse, unwanted visitors from town. She'd learned to read the land the way her father had taught her finding water, by following game trails and identifying edible plants by their leaves and roots. Skills that had seemed like childhood games now meant the difference between life and starvation. The wind never stopped here. It carved through the canyons with voices that sounded almost human, especially at night, when the coyotes added their chorus to the symphony of isolation. Clara had grown accustomed to sleeping with one hand on the rifle her father had left her, though she'd only fired it twice once at a rattlesnake that had taken up residence near her water source, and once into the air to scare off a mountain lion that had grown too bold. Her nearest neighbors were the Henderson family 5 miles south, and they'd made their position clear at the church social where she'd tried to introduce herself. Ain't natural for a girl to live alone like that, Mrs. Henderson had declared loud enough for half the congregation to hear. Brings bad luck to the whole valley. Mark my words, no good will come of it. Clara had stopped attending church, after that stopped trying to find her place in a community that saw her as a threat to the natural order. Instead, she threw herself into the work of survival, with the methodical intensity of someone who understood that self-reliance wasn't a choice, but a necessity. Her father's journal became her Bible, its pages filled with hard-won wisdom about surviving in harsh country. She memorized every entry how to find water by reading the color of distant hills which insects indicated rain, how to preserve meat without salt which roots could sustain life when game grew scarce. Knowledge accumulated through years of frontier living passed down to a daughter who would need every scrap of it to survive. Still, knowledge couldn't fill the gnawing emptiness in her stomach. When her traps came up empty, couldn't chase away the bone-deep loneliness that settled over her each evening, like fog rolling down from the mountains. She found herself talking to her parents' photograph, more often carrying on conversations with the wind, addressing questions to the hawks that circled overhead in lazy spirals. It was during one of these solitary conversations that she first noticed the sign's bent grass that spoke of careful passage stones, arranged in patterns that seemed too purposeful for chance. The feeling of being watched by eyes that held no malice. Someone was observing her daily struggle, someone who moved like smoke, and left traces only for those who knew how to read them. The realization should have frightened her. Instead, Clara found herself oddly comforted by the thought that she wasn't entirely alone in this vast, indifferent landscape. The storm struck without warning on a Tuesday evening in late April, transforming the peaceful spring twilight into a maelstrom of wind and lightning that seemed intent on scouring everything human from the landscape. Clara had noticed the clouds building throughout the day, towering thunderheads that turned the sky the color of fresh bruises, but the ferocity of the system caught her unprepared. The first gust hit like a physical blow, nearly knocking her off her feet as she struggled to secure her few precious possessions. Rain began falling in sheets so dense she could barely see her own hands, each drop striking the drought-hardened earth with the force of bullets. Within minutes, the seasonal creek behind her shelter had transformed from a gentle trickle into a roaring torrent that swallowed rocks and carried away everything in its path. Her lean-to, which had weathered countless smaller storms, began to sway and buckle under the relentless assault. The canvas covering snapped and flapped like a wounded bird trying to escape its bonds. Clara could hear the timber frame groaning against its moorings, could feel the whole structure shuddering with each fresh gust. She pressed herself against the rock wall, clutching her father's journal, and the eagle feather the Comanche stranger had given her, praying to whatever god might listen that the shelter would hold until the storm passed. It didn't. A particularly vicious gust howling down from the high peaks like the voice of some ancient fury caught the canvas and ripped it free with a sound like tearing silk. The exposed timber frame lasted another few seconds before collapsing in a tangle of broken wood and twisted rope. Clara threw herself toward the narrow overhang of the rock outcropping, but not before the falling debris caught her across the shoulder and sent her sprawling into the rapidly forming mud. She lay there in the darkness, rain pelting her face like cold fists, feeling the chill seep through her clothes and into her bones. The pain in her shoulder was sharp and immediate, but the deeper hurt was the realization that she'd lost everything again. Her shelter, most of her supplies, her one small claim to security in this vast, hostile world. The storm raged through the night with the persistence of something personal, as if the very elements had declared war on her existence. Clara remained huddled against the rock face, too injured and exhausted to do more than endure from one moment to the next. She drifted in and out of consciousness, her dreams filled with her parents' voices calling her name from somewhere impossibly far away. When dawn finally broke, pale and tentative through the dissipating clouds, Clara found herself staring at a pair of moccasins, the same ones she'd seen in town, worn by the same man who'd given her the eagle feather and shown her that kindness could exist even in the darkest moments. He stood motionless in the morning light, studying the wreckage of her life, with those ancient eyes that seemed to see straight through to her soul. Water dripped from his long black hair, and his clothes were soaked through from the storm, but he seemed as solid and enduring as the mountains themselves. "You stayed." Clara whispered, her voice barely audible after hours of exposure to wind and rain. He didn't answer directly, but he moved with purposeful efficiency, gathering the scattered timber and examining each piece with the practiced eye of a craftsman. His hands moved over the wood like a healer's over a patient, testing for structural soundness, measuring lengths and angles with the confidence of long experience. Clara watched from the ground, too weak to stand, as he began sorting the salvageable materials from the debris. There was something almost ceremonial in his movements, a reverence for the work of rebuilding that spoke of deeper understanding. Then he looked at her directly, and Clara saw something that made her breath catch in her throat. Not pity, which she'd grown to despise, but recognition. The acknowledgement of someone who understood what it meant to lose everything and still choose to rebuild, to face each new day with a stubborn determination that separated survivors from victims. Sheriff Beck arrived 3 days after the storm, his horse picking its way carefully through the rocky terrain, still slick with mud from the flash floods. Clara had managed to construct a crude windbreak from the salvaged timber, but it was barely adequate shelter for a person, let alone the supplies she needed to survive. The sheriff was a compact man in his 40s, with graying hair and the weathered features of someone who'd spent his life mediating between civilization and wilderness. His badge caught the morning sun as he dismounted, but his expression remained carefully neutral. The practiced face of a lawman who'd learned to navigate the treacherous currents of frontier politics. "Miss Wynn," he said, touching the brim of his hat with formal courtesy. "Folks in town are asking questions about your situation out here." Clara stood slowly, favoring her injured shoulder, which still ached from her encounter with the falling timber. "What kind of questions?" Beck's eyes swept over the neat piles of salvaged wood, the precisely engineered windbreak, the stone foundation that had clearly been laid by hands more skilled than Clara's slight fingers could manage. The kind that wonder how a young woman living alone suddenly acquired the skills of a master carpenter, he said carefully. The kind that notice when someone's getting help from unusual sources. Clara felt her chest tighten. The implication was clear. Her mysterious benefactor hadn't gone unnoticed by sharp eyes in town. "I've had some assistance." She admitted, seeing no point in denying what was obvious to anyone with eyes. "Nothing illegal about neighbors helping neighbors. Depends on the neighbor." Beck's voice hardened slightly, and Clara caught a glimpse of the steel beneath his diplomatic exterior. "Thomas Keene and some of the other ranchers claim you've been entertaining that Comanche who's been spotted in the area. They're saying he might be connected to those missing horses from the Keene spread." Clara's heart hammered against her ribs. "Gray Wolf hasn't stolen anything. He's been helping me rebuild after the storm." The name slipped out before she could stop it, revealing a familiarity that would raise eyebrows in a community where proper young women didn't even know the names of the men they encountered in church, let alone mysterious Comanche wanderers. Gray Wolf. Beck raised an eyebrow, his tone sharpening with interest. "You know his name now." Clara realized her mistake immediately. In a world where every interaction was scrutinized for signs of impropriety, admitting to personal knowledge of a Comanche man was tantamount to confessing to scandalous behavior. "He told me when I asked," she said, simply lifting her chin with a defiance she didn't entirely feel. "I believe in knowing the names of people who help me." Beck studied her for a long moment, and Clara could practically see him weighing his options. As sheriff, he was caught between upholding the law and maintaining the peace, two goals that didn't always align in a territory where prejudice and fear often masqueraded as justice. "Miss Wynn," he said finally, his voice gentler now, "I'm going to give you some advice, and I hope you'll take it in the spirit it's intended. Perception matters more than truth in a place like this. People get ideas, start talking, and talk has a way of turning ugly fast. You might want to consider whether this little homestead of yours is worth the trouble it's likely to bring." After he left, Clara stood in the growing heat of the day, feeling the weight of isolation settle over her like a familiar coat. She'd been naive to think she could simply exist here without drawing attention, that her small claim to independence wouldn't threaten someone's idea of how the world should work. That evening, as the sun painted the mountains purple and gold, she found a crude note tacked to the timber frame of her half-built shelter. The paper was rough, and the letters carved rather than written with the jagged intensity of barely controlled rage. "Squaws and savages ain't welcome here. Leave while you still have skin." Clara stared at the ugly words until darkness made them impossible to read, then carefully folded the paper and placed it inside her father's journal. Evidence, she told herself, though, evidence of what and for whom remained unclear. The message was unmistakable. Her struggle was no longer just against the elements and isolation. She now had human enemies, people who saw her very existence as a threat to their version of order. The thought should have terrified her. But instead, Clara felt something cold and hard crystallizing in her chest, a determination that surprised her with its intensity. They wanted her gone. They'd have to do better than anonymous threats and whispered accusations. She'd survived too much to be driven away by cowards who hid behind pieces of paper and other people's prejudices. Gray Wolf appeared at sunrise the next morning, materializing from the dawn shadows like a spirit of the desert itself. He examined the threatening note. Clara showed him his weathered face, revealing nothing, and then handed it back and began working on the shelter's foundation as if death threats were as common and insignificant as morning dew. "Aren't you worried?" Clara asked, watching him fit stones together with the precision of a master mason, each piece selected and placed with an understanding of forces and stress that spoke of deep knowledge. "Worry is for those who have time to spare," he replied in English, touched with an accent that spoke of mission schools and forced assimilation. "Survival requires all my attention." Over the following weeks, their collaboration deepened into something approaching true partnership. Gray Wolf taught her to read the subtle signs that revealed underground water sources, to identify which apparently worthless plants yielded medicine and food, to predict weather changes by observing the behavior of birds and insects. In return, Clara shared her father's accumulated wisdom, translating his notes on survival techniques and animal behavior. The structure taking shape between them was more than mere shelter. It was a testament to the possibility that two outcasts could create something neither could achieve alone. Grey Wolf's knowledge of stonework and timber, combined with Clara's careful planning and relentless determination, produced a dwelling that would withstand the harshest mountain weather. But their growing partnership hadn't escaped notice in Dry Creek. Thomas Keene began riding past Clara's property at irregular intervals, sometimes alone, sometimes accompanied by one or two of his cronies. They never approached directly, never made overt threats, but their presence was a constant reminder that she was being watched, judged, and found wanting by people who'd appointed themselves guardians of community standards. The tension escalated when a delegation of women from town arrived unannounced on a sweltering afternoon in late May. Mrs. Henderson led the group, her wagon loaded with what appeared to be a tribunal of moral judgment. The 5 women, all wives of prominent ranchers or businessmen, arranged themselves in a semicircle around Clara's workspace, like judges preparing to deliver a verdict. "Clara, dear." Mrs. Henderson began, her voice dripping with false sweetness that couldn't quite mask the steel beneath. "We need to have a serious conversation about your situation." The women's expressions ranged from disapproving to openly hostile. Clara recognized the look, the same mixture of disgust and fascination that people reserved for things they considered both repellent and compelling. "What situation would that be?" Clara asked, setting down her hammer and meeting their collective stare with as much dignity as she could manage. "Don't play innocent with us, child," snapped Mrs. Keene Thomas's mother, her thin lips pressed into a line of moral certainty. "The whole town's talking about you and that savage, living in sin, carrying on like animals." Clara felt heat flood her cheeks, but she kept her voice steady. "I'm not living in sin with anyone. Grey Wolf has been helping me rebuild after the storm, nothing more. Don't take us for fools." Mrs. Henderson declared, her voice rising with righteous indignation. "We've seen how you look at him, how he looks at you. It's unnatural, ungodly, and it won't be tolerated in a Christian community. What I do on my own land is my business," Clara replied, surprised by the steel in her own voice. "Not when it affects the moral fabric of our entire valley," said another woman, one Clara didn't recognize, but whose expensive dress and haughty bearing marked her as someone accustomed to having her opinions treated as gospel. "Bad enough having a wild Indian roaming free without you encouraging him to stay." The confrontation might have escalated into something truly ugly, if not for the timely arrival of Matilda Everdeen, and the widow who ran Dry Creek's only boarding house. She was a woman in her 50s, sharp-eyed and silver-haired, with a reputation for speaking her mind, regardless of the social consequences. "Ladies," Matilda said as she climbed down from her small buggy, her voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to managing unruly boarders and difficult situations. "I believe you're trespassing on private property." The delegation turned to face this unexpected interruption, their expressions shifting from righteous anger to confusion and irritation. "This is a community matter, Matilda," Mrs. Henderson said stiffly. "No concern of yours." A young woman being harassed on her own land by a mob of self-appointed moral guardians. Matilda's voice carried the sharp edge of someone who'd seen enough of the world to recognize hypocrisy when it presented itself. "I'd say that's everyone's concern who believes in basic human decency." The confrontation dissolved into uncomfortable murmurs and hasty departures. But Clara knew it was only a temporary reprieve. The lines were being drawn, sides chosen, and she found herself increasingly isolated, on the wrong side of public opinion. That night, someone set fire to the wooden framework of her new well cover. The blaze was small and easily extinguished, but the message was unmistakable. Escalation was now the language of conflict. and her enemies were prepared to move beyond words to action. Clara stood in the darkness, watching smoke rise from the charred remains of Grey Wolf's careful craftsmanship, and felt something fundamental shift inside her chest. They wanted a war she'd survived too much to back down now. Sheriff Beck returned on a Tuesday morning in early June. But this time, the gravity of his mission was unmistakable. 3 deputies rode with him, their badges glinting in the harsh sunlight, their hands resting casually but meaningfully on their gun belts. Clara watched them approach from her position beside the nearly completed cabin, her heart sinking as she recognized the grim formality of their formation. "Miss Wynn," Beck called out as he dismounted, his voice carrying the official weight of territorial law. "We need to speak with Grey Wolf, now." Grey Wolf emerged from the cabin's interior, where he'd been fitting the last of the window frames. His movements were unhurried despite the obvious threat. But Clara caught the subtle shift in his posture, the way a predator acknowledges danger without showing fear. "Grey Wolf." Beck continued, removing a folded warrant from his vest pocket. "You're under arrest for theft of livestock and destruction of private property." Clara felt the ground shift beneath her feet. What livestock? What property? 4 horses stolen from the Keene Ranch over the past month. One of the deputies answered, his young face set in lines of official severity. "Plus, damage to fencing on 3 separate occasions. We have multiple witnesses placing this man at the scene of each incident." "That's impossible," Clara protested, stepping forward to place herself between Grey Wolf and the law officers. "He was here working on the cabin. I can vouch for him." Beck's expression softened with what might have been genuine regret. "Miss Wynn, with all due respect, the testimony of a woman in your position isn't going to carry much weight against the sworn statements of 4 upstanding members of the community." The implication struck Clara like a physical blow. Her position as a woman alone, as an outsider, as someone who'd allied herself with a Comanche, rendered her word worthless in the eyes of territorial justice. "Who are these witnesses?" Clara demanded, her voice rising with desperation. "Thomas Keene, his brother Marcus, and 2 of their ranch hands," Beck replied, all prepared to swear under oath that they saw this man in the vicinity of each crime. Grey Wolf stepped forward, his hands raised peacefully. "I will come." "No." Clara said, her voice cracking with the weight of impending loss. "This is wrong. He hasn't done anything." That's when a new voice cut through the morning tension like a blade through silk. "I'm afraid there's been a serious mistake, Sheriff." Clara spun around to see Marcus Keene himself, approaching on horseback, his face pale and drawn, with what looked like sleepless guilt. Behind him rode Matilda Everdeen, her expression grimly satisfied, in a way that suggested she'd been expecting this moment. Beck frowned at the unexpected arrivals. "Marcus, what are you doing here?" The younger Keene brother dismounted with the jerky movements of a man fighting internal battles. He was several years older than Thomas, but had always lived in his brother's shadow, quieter and less given to the casual cruelties that marked his sibling's character. "I can't let this happen," Marcus said, his voice barely above a whisper. Thomas made me lie." The silence that followed was so complete that Clara could hear the wind singing through the canyon walls, could hear her own heart hammering against her ribs. "What kind of lie?" Beck asked, his voice dangerously quiet. Marcus pulled a folded paper from his shirt pocket with trembling hands. "Thomas paid me and the ranch hands to say we saw the Comanche stealing horses. Offered us $50 each to back up his story. But we never saw anything. Grey Wolf wasn't anywhere near our property on those dates." Beck stared at the confession as if it were a rattlesnake preparing to strike. "Are you telling me that 4 men committed perjury in sworn statements?" Thomas said it would just scare them off. Marcus continued, his voice gaining strength as the truth poured out of him. "Said it was for the good of the community, keeping undesirables from settling in. But then I heard you were actually going to arrest someone, and I couldn't be part of it anymore." Clara felt her knees go weak with relief, but the emotion was immediately replaced by a cold fury that surprised her with its intensity. "Where is Thomas now? Now that's what I'd like to know," Beck said grimly, taking the confession from Marcus's shaking hands. "This is a serious matter. Conspiracy perjury attempting to pervert the course of justice." "He's probably halfway to Colorado by now," Marcus admitted. "Left town last night with 2 saddlebags and his father's best horse. Said he had business in Denver, but..." The implication hung in the air, like smoke from a distant fire. Thomas Keene, faced with the collapse of his carefully constructed lies, had chosen flight over accountability. Beck studied the confession with the expression of a man watching his understanding of events undergo radical revision. "Mrs. Everdeen, did you know about this?" Matilda's smile held no warmth. "I suspected." Thomas was never as clever as he thought himself to be. "It wasn't hard to notice the inconsistencies in his story, especially when I took the trouble to check his movements against the supposed theft dates." "Why didn't you come forward sooner?" "Because I needed proof, not suspicions. And because sometimes the guilty need to convict themselves before justice can take its course." Beck folded the confession and placed it carefully in his vest pocket. "Grey Wolf, you're free to go. My apologies for the inconvenience." But even as relief flooded through Clara's system, she couldn't shake the feeling that they'd won only a single battle in a war that was far from over. Thomas might be gone, but the prejudice and fear that had driven his actions remained lurking in the hearts of others who saw change as a threat to their way of life. The retaliation came swift and brutal, striking at Clara's most vulnerable point, her growing sense of security. She woke 3 mornings after Thomas's flight to find her newly planted garden destroyed, the bean seedlings she'd nurtured from those precious seeds scattered and trampled into the mud. Worse, someone had poisoned her small water cache with what looked like lye, rendering it undrinkable, and forcing her to make the dangerous journey to the main creek in broad daylight. But the cruelest blow was personal. Nailed to her cabin door, she found her parents' daguerreotype, the only image she possessed of them, with their faces scratched out by a knife blade and the word "whore" carved into the wooden frame. Clara sank to her knees in the dirt, holding the mutilated photograph and feeling something break inside her chest. This wasn't just about prejudice or community standards anymore. This was about destroying her, utterly erasing not just her present, but her past, her very identity. Grey Wolf found her there an hour later, tears making tracks through the dust on her cheeks. He knelt beside her without speaking, studying the destroyed photograph with the same careful attention he brought to everything else. "They want to kill who I was before I can become who I'm meant to be," Clara whispered. "Then we must not let them." Grey Wolf replied, his voice carrying the quiet certainty of stone foundations and deep roots. "Your parents live in your actions, not in images. They live in the strength you show every day, in the home you're building, in the choice to keep fighting when others would surrender." That afternoon brought more visitors, but these came openly in the full light of day. Sheriff Beck rode up with a grim expression and unwelcome news. "Clara," he said, dismounting with the weariness of a man who'd grown tired of delivering bad news, "I've got word from the territorial court. Someone's filed an official complaint against you and Grey Wolf." Clara felt her heart sink. "What kind of complaint?" "Unlawful cohabitation. Violation of territorial morality statutes. The complainant is asking for your immediate eviction from the property and Grey Wolf's deportation to the reservation." Beck pulled out a legal document, its official seals and ribbons, somehow making the hatred behind it seem more civilized. "You've got until Sunday to respond. That's when Judge Morrison arrives from Santa Fe to hear the case." Clara stared at the document as if it were a death sentence. "Who filed the complaint?" Beck's expression grew even more troubled. "Mrs. Henderson, backed by a petition signed by 43 residents of Dry Creek and the surrounding area." The number hit Clara like a physical blow. 43 people, nearly half the adult population of the area, had formally declared her existence intolerable. "There's more," Beck continued reluctantly. "The territorial prosecutor is treating this as a test case. If they can make it stick here, they plan to use it as precedent for other, similar situations across New Mexico." Clara understood immediately. She and Grey Wolf weren't just fighting for their own survival. Now they were fighting for every mixed couple, every unconventional relationship, every person who dared to love across the arbitrary lines society had drawn. "What are our options?" she asked. Beck was quiet for a long moment, studying the mountains that rose beyond Clara's homestead. "Legally, not many. You could leave voluntarily, avoid the trial altogether. Or..." He paused, clearly reluctant to continue. "Or what? Or you could get married. Legally, officially, before Sunday. Make yourselves respectable in the eyes of the law, even if some folks never accept it." Clara felt her breath catch. Would that work? Maybe. Territorial law recognizes marriage as a fundamental right, even in unconventional circumstances. But it would have to be a real marriage performed by a licensed minister or judge, with proper witnesses and documentation. The silence stretched between them, heavy with implication and impossible choices. "Sheriff," Clara said finally, "would you perform the ceremony?" Beck's eyebrows rose in surprise. "Me?" "Territorial sheriffs have the authority to perform marriages in emergency circumstances," Clara said, remembering something her father had mentioned years ago. "This qualifies, doesn't it?" Beck studied her face, searching for something he apparently found there. "Miss Wynn, are you sure about this? Marriage isn't something you can undo easily, especially a marriage that's going to make you enemies for life." Clara looked at Grey Wolf, who had listened to the entire conversation in silence. In his dark eyes, she saw the same quiet determination that had drawn her to him from the beginning, and the refusal to be broken by circumstances beyond his control. "Grey Wolf," she said quietly, "will you marry me?" His answer came without hesitation. "I thought you would never ask." The wedding was set for Saturday evening one day, before Judge Morrison's arrival, and the legal proceedings that would determine their fate. But as the sun began its descent toward the western mountains, painting the sky in shades of blood and gold, Clara realized they wouldn't be facing their enemies alone. Matilda Everdeen arrived first, driving a wagon loaded with supplies, and accompanied by Martha Donnelly and Sarah Cross, two women Clara barely knew, but who had apparently decided that justice mattered more than social approval. Behind them came others, the blacksmith John Porter and his wife, the German immigrant family that ran the small farm south of town. Even Dr. Hawkins, who'd treated Clara's infected shoulder the previous month. "We figured you could use some witnesses," Matilda explained as she climbed down from her wagon. "And some folks to help you celebrate properly." Clara stared at the small crowd gathering in her yard, feeling something she hadn't experienced in months, the possibility of belonging somewhere, of being accepted, not despite her differences, but because of her courage. Sheriff Beck arrived as the sun touched the horizon, carrying his law books and wearing his best Sunday suit. "You sure about this?" he asked Clara one final time. "Never been more sure of anything in my life," she replied, and meant it. The ceremony itself was simple, conducted in the gathering dusk, with the canyon walls as witnesses and the desert wind as accompaniment. Clara wore her mother's wedding dress, carefully preserved in her father's trunk, while Grey Wolf had traded for a white cotton shirt that made his weathered features seem both ancient and timeless. But as Sheriff Beck began the traditional words, the sound of approaching horses interrupted the proceedings. Clara's heart clenched as she counted at least a dozen riders cresting the hill, their faces hidden in the shadows, but their hostile intent unmistakable. At their head rode a man Clara didn't recognize, tall, thin, wearing the black coat and white collar of a territorial judge. Beside him was Mrs. Henderson, her face set in lines of moral outrage. And behind them came a collection of men whose presence transformed the evening from celebration to confrontation. "Stop this proceeding immediately," the judge called out as his party approached. "I am Judge Morrison, and I have a court order preventing this marriage from taking place." Sheriff Beck stepped forward, his hand resting on his gun belt. "Judge Morrison, with respect, you have no authority to prevent a legal marriage between consenting adults. I do when that marriage is a transparent attempt to circumvent territorial law," Morrison replied, dismounting with the fluid grace of someone accustomed to command. "Mrs. Henderson has presented compelling evidence that this entire relationship is a sham designed to avoid prosecution for unlawful cohabitation." Clara felt the ground shifting beneath her feet once again. "What evidence?" Clara demanded, stepping forward with a courage that surprised even herself. Judge Morrison produced a thick folder from his saddlebag. "Sworn statements from multiple witnesses claiming that you and this Comanche have been living as man and wife for months without benefit of marriage. Furthermore, evidence that you've been operating an illegal business together, flouting territorial regulations regarding Native American commerce." Clara's mind reeled. Business? What business? The sale of handcrafted goods to travelers on the Santa Fe Trail. Mrs. Henderson interjected with vicious satisfaction. "Pottery beadwork carved items, all produced by your friend and sold under your name to avoid the restrictions on Indian commerce." It was true, Clara realized with growing horror. Gray Wolf had indeed crafted beautiful items during their time together. Bowls carved from juniper wood, decorative stones, arranged in patterns that caught the eye, small ornaments that told stories of his people. She'd never thought of it as commerce, but travelers had occasionally offered to purchase pieces, and she'd accepted the money they desperately needed for supplies. "That's not illegal," Sheriff Beck protested. "There's no law against—" Territorial Statute 47B specifically prohibits unlicensed commercial activity between whites and Native Americans. Judge Morrison interrupted. "The penalty is deportation for the Indian party and substantial fines for the white collaborator." Clara felt the trap closing around them like the jaws of some massive predator. Every choice they'd made, every small step toward building a life together, had been twisted into evidence of wrongdoing. That's when a new voice cut through the growing darkness. "Your Honor, I believe you're operating under false information." All eyes turned to see a figure emerging from the shadows beyond Clara's cabin, a man in a dusty traveling coat carrying saddlebags that bore the distinctive markings of territorial mail service. "Who are you?" Judge Morrison demanded. "Samuel Hayes, Territorial Land Surveyor." The man replied, producing official credentials that caught the firelight. "I've been conducting a survey of this area for the past 2 weeks, and I'm afraid Mrs. Henderson's statements contain significant inaccuracies." Clara felt a flicker of hope, though she couldn't understand how this stranger could possibly help them. Hayes opened his saddlebags and withdrew a series of official documents. "According to my survey records, Miss Wynn's homestead claim was filed legally and properly 6 months ago. More importantly, the land she's claimed contains significant mineral deposits that make it extremely valuable." The revelation sent a murmur through the assembled crowd. Valuable land changed everything in territorial politics. Furthermore, Hayes continued, "I have documented evidence that several of the complaints against Miss Wynn and Gray Wolf have been filed by parties with direct financial interest in acquiring her property. Specifically, the Keene family has been negotiating with railroad interests to sell right-of-way access through this very area." Clara stared at the surveyor in amazement. "Railroad interests? The Denver and Rio Grande Western is planning a spur line through this valley." Hayes explained. "Miss Wynn's property sits directly in the path of the proposed route. Her legal claim complicates their acquisition plans considerably." Judge Morrison's expression had shifted from righteous authority to careful calculation. "Are you suggesting this entire proceeding is motivated by commercial interests rather than moral concerns?" "I'm suggesting that truth has a way of being more complicated than it first appears." Hayes replied diplomatically. Mrs. Henderson's face had gone white. This is preposterous. We filed our complaints in good faith out of genuine concern for community standards. Did you? Hayes asked quietly. He withdrew another document from his collection. Because I have here a letter from Thomas Keene to the railroad company dated 3 weeks ago, promising to remove the obstacles to land acquisition through whatever means necessary. The silence that followed was broken only by the wind and the distant cry of a coyote. Clara could see the mathematics of power and influence recalculating themselves in Judge Morrison's mind. Sheriff Beck. Morrison said finally, "In light of these new developments, I'm inclined to allow this marriage to proceed, unless there are any further objections based on legitimate legal grounds rather than commercial considerations." The challenge hung in the air like smoke from a dying fire. Mrs. Henderson looked around desperately for support, but found her allies melting away into the darkness as quickly as they'd arrived. Without Thomas Keene's aggressive leadership and the promise of financial gain, the moral crusade had lost its momentum. "No objections, Your Honor," Sheriff Beck said with barely concealed satisfaction. The wedding resumed under a canopy of stars, with the territorial judge himself serving as an unwilling but legally binding witness. When Beck pronounced them husband and wife, Clara felt something fundamental shift in her understanding of herself and her place in the world. The weeks following the wedding brought changes to Dry Creek that rippled outward like stones thrown into still water. The revelation about the railroad's interest in Clara's property had fundamentally altered the political landscape, transforming her from a social pariah into someone whose goodwill carried actual value. Samuel Hayes remained in the area to complete his survey work, and his presence served as a reminder that territorial authorities were now aware of the attempted land grab, disguised as moral crusade. Several of Mrs. Henderson's most vocal supporters quietly withdrew their names from her petition, claiming they'd been misled about the true nature of the situation. Clara and Grey Wolf found themselves in the unexpected position of being not just tolerated, but cautiously courted by some community members. The blacksmith offered to shoe their horses at reduced rates. The general store extended credit for supplies. Even Dr. Hawkins stopped by to check on Clara's shoulder and stayed for coffee, asking Grey Wolf detailed questions about traditional Comanche medicine. But the transformation wasn't universal or complete. A core group of residents remained hostile, led by Mrs. Henderson, who seemed to take their defeat as a personal affront to the natural order. These holdouts expressed their displeasure through petty sabotages, missing tools, gates left open, small fires that required constant vigilance to prevent from spreading. Grey Wolf accepted these irritations with the same stoic patience he brought to everything else. "Change is like water wearing down stone," he told Clara one evening as they repaired fence posts that had been mysteriously damaged overnight. It happened slowly then, all at once. The arrival of the railroad surveyors in early July marked the beginning of the end for the old Dry Creek. The proposed rail line would bring commerce growth and an influx of new residents who might view an interracial couple as merely unusual rather than scandalous. Clara found herself in the peculiar position of being consulted about land use and development plans, her legal claim to the property now recognized as legitimate and valuable. Thomas Keene remained absent, though rumors placed him in various locations across Colorado and Kansas. His father had quietly sold the family ranch to cover debts related to the failed land speculation scheme, leaving Marcus to rebuild the family's reputation through honest work and genuine community service. The new barn rose from the ashes of the old one, larger and more solidly built, with help from neighbors who had gradually come to respect Grey Wolf's skill and Clara's determination. The cabin gained proper windows, a stone chimney, and a second room that Grey Wolf built with an eye toward the future, and toward children who might someday play in this hard-won sanctuary. Most importantly, the well that Grey Wolf had begun digging finally struck water at 42 feet, ensuring that Clara's homestead would never again be dependent on seasonal streams for survival. The day they drew the first bucket of clear cold water, Clara understood that they had achieved something beyond mere survival. They had created genuine security in a landscape that offered none. Sheriff Beck became a regular visitor, stopping by to share news from town and to enjoy Grey Wolf's coffee, which he claimed was the best in the territory. Through him, they learned that Judge Morrison had quietly launched an investigation into similar attempts to use moral legislation as cover for commercial land grabs, and that their case had become something of a precedent in territorial legal circles. Justice moves slow. Beck told Clara one afternoon as they watched Grey Wolf train their new mare. But sometimes it moves in directions you don't expect. Clara nodded, thinking of her father's journal and his notes about patience being a survival skill as important as any other. She'd learned to read weather patterns and find water in barren ground to build shelter from scattered materials and protect what mattered most. Now she was learning to read the even more complex patterns of human community, how trust could be rebuilt, how enemies could become allies, how small acts of courage could create change that spread far beyond their origin. The confrontation Clara had been dreading came on a blazing afternoon in late August, when the desert heat made the air shimmer like water, and every shadow was precious as gold. She was working in her expanded garden, harvesting the beans that had finally fulfilled their promise, when she saw the lone rider approaching from the direction of town. Even at a distance, she recognized the distinctive slouch and aggressive posture Thomas Keene had returned to Dry Creek. He dismounted 50 yards from her cabin, his face gaunt with months of hard living, and his clothes bearing the dust of long travel. But his eyes held the same mixture of fury and desperation that had driven him to construct the web of lies that had nearly destroyed her life. "Well, well," Thomas called out, his voice cracking with barely controlled emotion. "Look what's still here. The little mouse who thought she could change the world." Clara straightened slowly, feeling the weight of the rifle Grey Wolf had insisted she keep close while working alone. "Thomas, I heard you'd found other places to spend your time. He couldn't stay away forever," he replied, stepping closer with the cautious movements of a predator testing its prey. "Had to come back and see what you'd built on the bones of my family's future. Your family's future was built on lies and theft," Clara said quietly. "I didn't destroy it, you did when you chose deception over honest work." Thomas laughed, but the sound held no humor. "Honest work you call whoring yourself to a savage honest work." The insult hung in the desert air like heat lightning, dangerous and unpredictable. Clara felt something cold and hard crystallize in her chest, not fear, but a kind of clarity she'd never experienced before. "I call it love," she said simply. "Something you wouldn't recognize if it introduced itself with a brass band." That's when she noticed Thomas wasn't alone. 2 other men had appeared from behind a stand of juniper trees, their faces unfamiliar, but their intentions clear in the way they positioned themselves to cut off her escape routes. "See, that's your problem," Thomas continued, apparently emboldened by his backup. "You never learned your proper place, never understood that some things just ain't meant to be." Clara's hand moved slowly toward the rifle leaning against her garden fence. "And what exactly are you planning to do about it? Going to teach you a lesson that should have been taught months ago?" Thomas replied, his hand moving to rest on his gun belt. "Going to send a message that decent folk won't tolerate your kind of behavior." That's when Grey Wolf's voice cut through the tension like a blade through silk. "The only message being sent today is that bullies who prey on women are cowards who deserve no man's respect." Thomas spun around to see Grey Wolf emerging from the cabin, but he wasn't alone. Beside him walked Sheriff Beck, his badge catching the afternoon sunlight, and behind them came Samuel Hayes and 3 other men Clara didn't immediately recognize. "What is this?" Thomas demanded, his voice rising to a near shriek as he realized his carefully planned ambush had become something else entirely. "This," Sheriff Beck said calmly, "is justice finally catching up with you, Thomas. We've been waiting for you to come back." Beck produced a folded warrant from his vest pocket. Thomas Keene, you're under arrest for conspiracy to commit perjury, attempted fraud, and now it appears harassment and threatening behavior. You can't prove anything. Thomas snarled, but Clara could hear the fear beneath his bravado. Actually, we can. Samuel Hayes said, stepping forward with a leather satchel. Your friends here were kind enough to provide detailed confessions about your plan to, and I quote, scare the half-breed and his whore into leaving permanent-like. Clara looked at Thomas's two companions and saw that their hands were already secured behind their backs with iron shackles. Their faces bore the expressions of men who discovered that loyalty had its limits when faced with territorial prison sentences. Furthermore, Hayes continued, we have documentation of your communications with railroad interests, including specific promises to clear title to Miss Wynn's property through illegal means. The trap was complete, Clara realized. Thomas had walked into a carefully prepared snare, his own arrogance and hatred blinding him to the possibility that his enemies might have learned to plan as ruthlessly as he did. This ain't over, Thomas said as Beck fitted him with shackles, but his voice lacked the conviction it had carried moments before. Yes, it is, Grey Wolf said quietly. It's been over since the moment you chose hatred over acceptance, lies over truth. As Beck led his prisoners away, Clara found herself alone with Grey Wolf in the gathering dusk. The garden around them was green with promise, the cabin solid and welcoming, the well providing clear water that tasted of security and home. Do you think it's really finished? Clara asked, watching the dust cloud raised by the departing horses settle in the still air. Grey Wolf considered the question with the same careful attention he brought to everything else. The immediate danger, yes. But change takes generations, not months. There will be other challenges, other people who see difference as threat. Clara nodded, understanding that their victory was both complete and partial. They had won the right to exist, to love, to build a life together. But they had not transformed the world that would continue to judge them. Are you ready for that? She asked. Instead of answering directly, Grey Wolf took her hand and led her to the cabin's front porch where they could watch the first stars appear in the darkening sky. As the desert wind began its nightly song through the canyon walls, he spoke the words that would become the foundation of everything they built together. I was cast out from my people for refusing to forget who I was. You were abandoned for being too small to matter in their plans. But together, we are exactly the right size for the life we've chosen to build. Clara smiled, feeling the turquoise bracelet warm against her wrist, thinking of the woman who had worn it before her, and the legacy of strength it represented. I was once too small for this world, she whispered. Now I am its equal. The months that followed brought the railroad just as Samuel Hayes had predicted. With it came merchants, settlers, and a gradual dilution of the old certainties that had made Clara and Grey Wolf's love seem so threatening. Their cabin became a way station for travelers, their story a testament to the possibility that love could survive even in the harshest places. Some visitors were scandalized by what they found a white woman married to a Comanche man living in defiance of social conventions. Others were curious, asking careful questions about how two such different people had found common ground. A few were inspired, seeing in their partnership a glimpse of what the territory might become as it grew beyond the narrow prejudices of its founding. Clara kept detailed records of their visitors in her father's journal, documenting not just names and dates, but the slow evolution of attitudes and assumptions. She watched her small homestead become part of a larger story, the transformation of the American West from a place where difference was feared to one where it might eventually be celebrated. Grey Wolf built furniture for their expanding home, each piece crafted with the precision and care that had first drawn Clara to him. Their second room became a workshop, where he taught interested visitors traditional Comanche techniques for working wood and stone, quietly breaking down barriers through the simple act of shared knowledge. The railroad brought mail service, and through it, Clara maintained correspondence with other women who had chosen unconventional paths. She learned of other interracial couples scattered across the territory, other small victories in the long war against prejudice and fear. Her letters became a lifeline for women facing similar challenges, proof that love could survive and even flourish in the face of determined opposition. On their first wedding anniversary, Sheriff Beck rode out to join them for dinner, bringing news that Judge Morrison had used their case as precedent in 3 other territorial court decisions. The legal framework that had once threatened to destroy them was slowly being reshaped to protect others facing similar persecution. "You two started something bigger than you know," Beck told them as they sat on their porch watching the sunset paint the mountains in shades of gold and purple. "Not just for yourselves, but for everyone who comes after." Clara squeezed Grey Wolf's hand, feeling the calluses that spoke of honest work and the warmth that spoke of unshakable love. They had survived the immediate crisis, weathered the storm of hatred and fear, but more than that, they had helped to change the very ground on which such storms took root. As the stars appeared in the desert sky, Clara thought of all the small choices that had brought them to this moment. Her decision to stand up to Thomas Keene Grey Wolf's choice to help a struggling stranger, the courage of people like Matilda Everdeen and Marcus Keene, who had chosen truth over comfort, justice over conformity. "Do you ever regret it?" she asked Grey Wolf as they prepared for bed in the home they had built from determination and hope. The difficulties, the struggles, the way some people still look at us. Grey Wolf's answer came in the form of action rather than words. He took her hands and placed them over his heart, letting her feel the steady rhythm that had become as familiar as her own breathing. "I regret nothing that brought us to this moment," he said quietly. "Not the hardship, not the conflict, not even the pain. All of it was the price of building something real in a world that too often settles for what is easy." Clara smiled, thinking of the children they might have someday, the legacy they would leave the small corner of the world they had claimed for love and defended with everything they possessed. Outside, the desert wind sang its ancient song through the canyon walls, carrying stories of transformation and hope, of small people who had learned to stand tall, of outcasts who had found their way home. And in the morning, Clara and Grey Wolf would wake to begin another day of proving that love, like water in the desert, could flourish in the most unlikely places. Their story was complete, not because their lives were finished, but because they had answered the only question that truly mattered. Is it possible for 2 people to create something larger than themselves, something that no amount of hatred or fear can destroy? The answer lay in the solid walls of their cabin, in the clear water flowing from their well, in the garden growing green and strong despite the harsh desert soil. The answer was written in the legal precedents their courage had established, in the letters that carried their story to other struggling couples across the territory, in the slow but steady change they had helped to create. The answer was yes. It was not only possible, but inevitable. As long as there were people willing to choose love over fear, truth over convenience, and hope over despair. Clara and Grey Wolf had become living proof that even the smallest among us can change the world. One choice at a time, one day at a time, one act of courage at a time. And that truth would outlive them both, carried forward by every person who heard their story and chose to believe that love was stronger than hate, that justice was worth fighting for, and that home was not a place, but a promise. A promise that 2 people could make to each other and keep against all odds until the very stars burned out above the desert sky.